In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate how to knit the heel shaping of a plain heel, aka an Insta-thought heel, using central double decreases. This technique also works for peasant heels. You can jump to a specific point in the video by hovering over the video timeline to find the relevant chapter link, or by using the direct links down in the video description. So today I'm going to show you how you can use central double decreases to shape your peasant heels or plain heels rather than using single decreases. So I have two examples here, this little sock sample where I started the double decreases right at the very beginning and worked them all the way until it was time to graft. And in this sock, I used a technique that I demonstrated last week where I created more stitches for the sole half of the round because I wanted to create more room in the diagonal. And so for the first several rounds, I had to work single decreases to eliminate the extra stitches in this half of the round, and then I was able to transition into the central double decrease. So whether you start out with your two halves of the round exactly the same, or you have modified to create more room in your provisional cast on for the plain heel, you can use the central double decreases. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mark the stitches that are going to become that line of decreases. So we're going to mark the stitch that's going to be this stitch that becomes this vertical line right here. So you're going to need some locking stitch markers. And what you're going to do, so what I've done here, I've knit across the heel, I did my provisional cast on, and then I worked one plain round. So now it's when it's time to mark the stitches. So I'm going to take the very first stitch that's on the needle. I'm going to put the locking marker around the stitch that's directly under that. I'm going to place that there. And then I'm going to come to the other half of the round and I'm going to place a marker around that stitch right here. Now what I need to do is rearrange the stitches so that I can actually work these central double decreases, because a double decrease involves 3 stitches and the central double decrease ends up so that the stitch that's in the middle is on top. So that means that the stitch to the right and the stitch to the left are eliminated. And if I have my stitches arranged in a round like this, I can't access the stitches that are to the right of the stitch that will become the top stitch in that line. So what I'm going to do is find the midpoint of each half of the round. So I have 20 stitches on this half of the round, so I need to count off 10 stitches and mark that middle point. Now on this half of the round, I have 24 stitches because I provisionally cast on extra stitches in order to simulate a heel where I would need more room at the instep. So the midpoint of this half of the round is going to be 12 stitches. So you should have 2 stitches actually marked, and then you should have the midpoint of each half of the round. So what you're going to do now is knit up to this first marker. I'm using the magic loop technique, so I have a long circular needle that I'm using to knit a small circumference item. You can use magic loop, you can use the 2 circulars method, you could use double pointed needles. I think it's a little trickier for this particular situation, but because you'll end up having to rearrange stitches throughout the heel, but you can do it. So now I've gotten to this marker. I just take this marker off the needle. And now is when I'm going to rearrange it. So again, I'm using magic loop, so I can just pull this needle like that. And then here's the midpoint of that other. This is where I wanted to divide the round this time. So I want my 2 halves to be like this. And so this marker over here I can just remove now. Now we're going to start working the decreases. If you provisionally cast on the same number of stitches that you had already, You can skip this next part because I will be doing some single decreases. You can hover over the timeline here at the bottom of the video screen and you can find where the central double decrease portion actually begins. If you provisionally cast on more stitches than you originally had, then you are going to be needing to do some rounds with single decreases. So I provisionally cast on 24 stitches instead of the 20 stitches that I put on waste yarn. So I'm going to need to work 4 rounds before I begin my central double decreases. So I'm knitting up to the marked stitch. And now I'm going to work an SSK decrease. That is a left leaning decrease. That means when these 2 stitches are worked together, the one that I have marked right here, that column of stitches is going to end up on top. So you work that by slipping 2 stitches one at a time as if to knit, inserting through the fronts of those 2 needles and then working together. And that creates a decrease where the stitch remains on top. So every time I actually decrease, I'm going to move this marker. I find this to be really helpful if I'm using variegated yarn or dark yarn where it can be hard to see where if I actually decrease on a round or not. And so when I decrease, I put that marker there. So now I'm going to knit until I get to 2 stitches before the next marker. So I've got 2 stitches, including the marked stitch, and now I'm going to work a knit 2 together. So knit 2 together is a right leaning decrease, and it's going to put this marked stitch on top when I work those 2 together. We can remember that it's right leaning because when we insert our needle through the 2 stitches, the working needle is pointed to the right. And again, when I work a decrease, I'm going to move that marker so that I can remember that this stitch was decreased. And now I knit until I get to the next marker. Okay, so I'm back at this orange marker, and because I can see that my marker is around that stitch that's right under the needle, I can remember that I actually did a decrease here in case I can't see it. Like again, if my yarn is dark or variegated or the stitches are very tiny, it can be hard to see. So if I see that this stitch marker is right beneath the needle, then I know that I don't need to work another decrease. I need to work a plain round. So now I'm approaching the marker where I know I need to do decreases. So how can you tell if you still have more stitches on this half of the round than the other half? Well, you start by counting the stitch that's marked here, and you count until the stitch before the next marked stitch. So I can count all of the stitches from here, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22. I've got 22 stitches and I need to get down to 20. So now I know I still have one more decrease round to do with the single decreases. So now I know I have one plain round left to work before I start my central double decreases. So now we're ready to begin our central double decreases. We are at the same place that we would have been if we didn't have extra stitches and didn't need to work single decreases. We're going to knit until 2 stitches before the marked stitch. So the marked stitch and the 1 stitch to the right, we're going to stop at that point. Now we're going to work the central double decrease. Insert your needle as if you're doing a knit 2 together. So you insert through both of those stitches, but you just let them come off the needle. And then you knit this next stitch. And now you're going to pass those 2 slip stitches over the top. So it's important that you're slipping them together as if you were knitting them together, because that's how you end up with this center stitch on top. So once we have done a decrease, We want to move our marker to mark that stitch right below the needle to show that we just decreased that stitch. And now we're going to knit until we are 2 stitches before the next marker. Insert as if to knit 2 together. This remounts and reorders the stitches. And then we knit the next stitch. And then we can pass those 2 slip stitches over. And then we end up with that center stitch on top. And again, we're going to move our marker. As we approach the marker, if we can see that we decreased on the round before, we're just going to work a plain round. So now we can see, because the marker is 2 rows below the needle, that this is going to be a decrease round. We're going to keep alternating decrease round with a plain round until the number of stitches remaining is about 1/3 of the stitches we started with when we started the central double decreases. So I had 40 stitches when I started the central double decrease. So I'm going to continue until I have about 12 stitches remaining, so 6 stitches on each half. So I'm about to start my final round of decreases. So when you work the decreases, you're going to work a decrease round to end with, and you are not going to work a plain round after that. So it's time for my final decrease round. So I'm going to knit the final central double decrease. Here's my second one. So I've completed that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to rearrange the stitches again so that I can graft the socks. So what I'm going to do is just knit up until right before that line of decreases right there. So I have 1/2 of the round starts with this decrease, and then the other half ends starts there, so that the working yarn is attached to the stitch prior to this first decrease. So now I can do my graft across those stitches. So you can see that at the beginning, this line of decreases here was formed by the single decreases, but then it merged into the double decrease line here, and it goes smoothly into that. So whether or not you have extra stitches on 1/2 of the round when you start, you can still use the central double decrease technique, provided that you start with the single decreases that lead into the double decreases. Plain heels and peasant heels can be modified and adapted in many ways. This video demonstrated how to use the central double decrease to make an aesthetic change to these heels, but you can also modify these heels for a better fit. If you'd like to learn more about modifying plain heels or peasant heels, check out these videos over here. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.